Welcome to Thinking Deeper by 6-7. We are pulling back the curtain on the ultimate cosmic debate today. I mean, we're talking God, atheism, and, well, the true nature of evil.
The really light stuff, right?
Oh, exactly.
Yeah.
So from modern atheists who actively call themselves Satanists to the extreme demon-haunted worldview of Jehovah's Witnesses, we are exploring how humans define morality. Like, is the devil a literal monster ruling the world, a convenient scapegoat, or a misunderstood symbol of freedom?
It's a massive question.
It really is. And if you like my channel, please subscribe, press the like button. So to really unpack all of this, we're pulling from two completely fascinating sources today.
Yeah, they are super interesting.
Right. One is a Jubilee video featuring this incredibly candid face-to-face debate between followers of major religions and self-proclaimed Satanists. And the other is a deep dive video from XJW Panda Tower, which breaks down the theology of Jehovah's Witnesses.
Before we jump into all the mechanics of these beliefs, though, I think we really need to set the stage for this deep dive. Because we are stepping into some deeply personal territory for a lot of people, so we just need to be super clear that in this deep dive, we are impartially exploring these fascinating philosophical and religious perspectives. We are not endorsing any specific viewpoint here.
Right, exactly.
Like whether it's left-wing, right-wing, theological, or atheistic, we aren't taking sides. Our goal is purely to unpack the ideas exactly as they presented in these sources.
Which means, I think, we need to start at the absolute beginning, because to understand how modern groups use this concept of ultimate evil, we kind of have to look at where the villain actually came from.
Yeah, the origin story.
Because people generally just assume the devil has always been this eternal, unchanging figure with a pitchfork ruling an underground inferno. But that XJW Panda Tower source completely dismantles that idea.
It really does. The historical evolution of Satan is actually shockingly bureaucratic.
Bureaucratic.
Yeah, totally bureaucratic. When you look at the original Hebrew texts of the Old Testament, the word ha-Satan wasn't a proper name at all.
Wait, really? It wasn't a name?
No, not at all. It was a job title. It literally translates to the opposer or the adversary.
Oh, wow.
You can basically think of it like a prosecuting attorney in God's celestial court. If you look at the book of Job, for example, this figure isn't some demonic king of the underworld. He's just an angel doing his assigned job.
Which was what, exactly?
Basically cross-examining humanity's motives. He even has to explicitly ask God for permission to test Job. So he operates strictly within the divine system.
Okay, so that presents a massive historical mystery then. Because how do we get from a celestial prosecutor filing paperwork in heaven to the supreme architect of all human suffering? I mean, a culture doesn't just wake up one Tuesday and rewrite its entire core theology.
Right, there has to be a catalyst. And the source points out that the catalyst was a massive geopolitical collision.
Okay.
So this concept of a totally evil counterpart to God, it didn't really take shape in Jewish theology until the Babylonian exile in the 6th century BCE.
When the Israelites were conquered?
Exactly. They were conquered, relocated, and suddenly they're living under the Persian Empire. And the Persians practiced Zoroastrianism.
Which has a totally different structure.
Yeah, it's built on this strict cosmic duality. They had a supreme god of good, and they had a figure called Angra Mainyu, who was this spirit of pure evil, and they were locked in an eternal cosmic war.
So it was like a complete binary.
Precisely. And through decades of cultural mixing, that Persian concept of a rival evil deity bled into the Hebrew theology. So that celestial lawyer absorbed the traits of Angra Mainyu and morphed into the cosmic rebel that we recognize today.
That is just wild to think about. Seeing how a religion adopts the theology of an occupying empire, it gives you a totally different perspective on how belief systems are built.
It really does.
And it perfectly explains how that historical seed eventually blossoms into the extreme theology of these high-control groups today. Like in the Jehovah's Witness worldview, Satan isn't just an antagonist. He is elevated to the literal main driver of the biblical plot.
Yeah, he becomes the central mechanism for everything.
Right. Their theology claims that Satan challenged God's right to rule back in the Garden of Eden. And in response, God essentially hits pause on paradise and allows Satan to rule the earth for 6,000 years.
Just to settle the challenge.
Exactly, to settle this universal court case in front of all the observing angels.
And high-control groups use this specific narrative to solve one of the oldest philosophical dilemmas ever, which is the problem of evil.
The whole, if God is all-powerful and all-loving, why is there so much suffering?
Right. And the Jehovah's Witness literature tries to solve this with a really specific analogy. They say it's like a teacher who lets a rebellious student take over the class.
Oh, I remember this from the source.
Yeah, so the student says the teacher's methods are wrong. So to prove a point to the rest of the class, the teacher steps back, hands the chalk to the rebel, and lets them teach, knowing full well it's going to end in disaster.
Okay, I have to jump in here because
Okay.
that analogy makes zero logical sense when you actually apply it to real human suffering.
I mean, it definitely has flaws.
Huge flaws. A real, responsible teacher wouldn't let a rebellious student ruin the education, and in this metaphor, the literal lives of the entire classroom, just to stroke their own ego,
Right.
just to prove they were right all along.
Yeah, the collateral damage is massive.
Plus, if we follow the biblical narrative they use, God isn't just sitting passively at the teacher's desk taking notes. He's actively intervening. He's flooding the earth, he's whispering hints to some students, and he's actively shooting down anyone who argues with the rebel. Like, if you were a student in that classroom, would you think the teacher was fair or just proving a point at your expense?
That is exactly the friction that the analogy is trying to cover up, because when a religious leadership uses Satan to explain all human misery, they construct this closed psychological loop.
Right.
God is entirely exempt from blame for the state of the world, but he still requires total, unquestioning obedience to his representatives. So the narrative demands that you view literally everything outside the group as the active domain of the devil.
But see, when a group defines ultimate good as just unquestioning obedience to an authority figure, they inevitably spawn a counter movement,
Yeah.
a movement that views that exact same authority as tyranny.
Oh, absolutely.
And that is exactly where modern atheism enters the chat, which brings us to our second source, the Jubilee video. Because modern skeptics and atheists haven't just rejected the concept of Satan, they've completely flipped the script. They've reclaimed the figure as a hero.
And we really need to make a crucial distinction here about the Satanists in that Jubilee debate.
Right, like Jason, Lois, and Richard Lale.
Exactly. They do not believe in a literal horned deity. They are atheists. They're secular humanists.
So they aren't worshiping an evil spirit.
Not at all. For them, Satan is purely a symbol. It's a literary device for liberty, freedom, bodily autonomy, and the separation of church and state.
It's like reading a classic novel, but from the villain's perspective. Suddenly, the hero of the story looks like a tyrant who demands absolute obedience, and the villain looks like a whistleblower offering free will.
That is a perfect way to put it.
And you see this clash so clearly when the Jubilee panel talks about the Garden of Eden. Because Sean, the Christian pastor, argues the traditional view, right? That God created an environment of pure love and peace for humans to flourish.
But the atheist panel members look at the exact same text and extract the complete opposite moral conclusion.
That's totally day and night.
It really is. Their perspective is that God placed humans in the garden to be ignorant playthings. One of the atheists actually says God deliberately kept humans naked and stupid because he was bored.
Naked and stupid.
Yeah. So in their framework, the serpent wasn't deceiving humanity. The serpent was the first advocate for equal rights. Offering the fruit of knowledge was about giving humans the ability to actually take moral responsibility.
Which makes me wonder, is this just a provocative rebranding, or does it genuinely change how these people define what is good? Because if your ultimate symbol of goodness is a deity who demands obedience, your morality looks vastly different than if your ultimate symbol is a rebel demanding knowledge.
It fundamentally changes their definition of good. And this tension hits a total boiling point when the group discusses the concept of hell.
Oh man, yeah, the hell debate was intense.
Hell is the ultimate deal breaker for the atheist perspective. They argue that a deity who would burn people in an eternal lake of fire simply for non-belief is inherently malevolent.
Especially since, according to theology, that deity is omniscient.
Exactly. They point out that if God knows everything, he knows exactly what it would take to convince an atheist to believe. If he chooses not to provide that evidence and then tortures them eternally for not believing, he's basically engineering their failure.
So to them, that makes him totally unworthy of worship.
Completely unworthy, regardless of his power.
And the clash over Jesus' sacrifice was just as explosive. Because the Christian pastor, Sean, talks about grace as Jesus taking the penalty for humanity's sins. But then the Satanist sharply undercuts the whole thing by saying Jesus just, quote, gave up a weekend.
Gave up a weekend, yeah. Because he died, came back as God 3 days later, and went to eternal paradise.
Wait, I have to ask, though, is that just them being edgy for the sake of the debate? Or is there a real philosophical point there? because giving up a weekend sounds incredibly dismissive of something billions of people revere.
It is abrasive, but it's an actual critique of transactional theology. They're questioning the morality of a father sacrificing his son as a requirement for forgiveness. Like, why does an all-powerful being need to exploit a violent loophole to show mercy?
Right, why not just forgive them?
Exactly.
But we can't ignore the defense from the major religions there.
Yeah.
Amr, the Muslim participant, and the Christian perspectives, they argue that a place of justice is absolutely necessary because humans commit terrible deeds.
Right. If a dictator slaughters millions and dies peacefully, where is the justice?
Exactly. So they argue that just as there is a place of grace for the good, there has to be a place of justice for the evil.
And what's really interesting is the nuance from Rajini, the Hindi participant.
Oh, right. Her perspective was so different.
Yeah. She explains that in Hinduism, the adversary isn't an ultimate evil that rivals God. Instead, Satan is more like an assistant to God.
An assistant.
Yeah, an assistant who causes disruption, but that disruption is for the ultimate spiritual benefit and growth of humans.
Which completely shifts how you view objective versus subjective morality, which actually brings up that really weird specific example from the Jubilee video.
The toilet paper.
Yes. The guy hoarding 10 packs of toilet paper during the pandemic.
Yeah.
Like, to the hoarder, he was doing a right act to protect his family. He's the hero of his own story. But to society, he's being selfish and wrong. It just makes you wonder, how can we judge God's morality when human morality changes depending on whether you're the one hoarding the paper or the one trying to buy it?
It's the core dilemma of the human experience, and it shows that this theological clash isn't just some abstract debate. It fundamentally dictates how people experience their daily lives.
Oh, 100%.
It dictates whether a belief in spiritual forces brings you comfort and purpose, or if it just breeds intense paranoia.
And speaking of paranoia, we have to talk about the XJWU source again. Because the extreme paranoia of a demon-haunted worldview is just staggering.
It really is. It stems from their interpretation of 1 Corinthians 10.21, this idea of the table of Jehovah versus the table of demons.
Right, there's literally no middle ground.
None at all. And it leads to these wild urban legends within the community, like stories of demon-possessed Smurf dolls literally walking out of kingdom halls.
A Smurf doll. I mean, from the outside, it sounds like a joke.
But inside, it is sheer terror. They believe that owning a toy wizard or watching a movie with magic literally invites demons to attack your family. There are stories of levitating beds caused by occult items.
Imagine living with that constant anxiety. Like, imagine you're cleaning out your attic and you find an old Harry Potter book. To most people, that's just nostalgia. To them, it's a spiritual landmine.
It's hypervigilance. You can never relax in your own home.
It really makes you ask, how much of our behavior is driven by the genuine desire to be good versus the sheer terror of being punished by an invisible force?
And that fear is such a stark contrast to how the Jubilee participants view their daily purpose.
Oh, totally. Because the mainstream religious people in that video, they actually find immense comfort in God, right? Especially during crises like the pandemic. It gives them a unifying higher purpose.
But then you contrast that with the atheist and Satanist approach. They completely reject the idea of a prescriptive higher purpose assigned by a deity.
Like someone pointing down and saying, I choose you.
Exactly. They don't want that. Instead, they find goodness in self-reliance. They focus on taking care of themselves so they don't cause anarchy, and they focus on daily micro-actions of goodness.
Just helping out your neighbor because it's the right thing to do.
Right, without the threat of a cosmic observer watching their every move.
It's just a completely different way of navigating the world. I mean, we have covered an incredible spectrum today. From the historical evolution of a celestial prosecutor, to high-control groups living in terror of Smurf dolls, to atheists adopting the moniker of Satan to advocate for human rights and question the morality of hell.
It really shows how flexible human belief is. The exact same concept can be used for extreme control or extreme liberation.
Which leaves you with a pretty wild thought to chew on. If the human concept of ultimate evil has constantly evolved, from a bureaucratic angel in a heavenly court to a horned monster to a modern symbol of civil rights and bodily autonomy, what will the devil look like 100 years from now? Will future generations view our current definitions of good and evil as divine truths, or just the psychological reflections of what we feared most in our own time? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. Keep questioning the narratives you've been handed, and we will catch you next time.